So much is happening in the fashion industry right now. From high-profile acquisitions like Chanel and L'Oreal investing in the row, which I'm personally quite nervous about, especially given that I made a video not so long ago about the row's unique position of independent ownership and hence creative freedom, to new creative director buzz for Chanel and Eddie Slimane leaving Celine. Fashion cycles move at such a rapid pace nowadays that every trend comes and goes in a blink of an eye. Before I can even stop to breathe and absorb the new obsession, the climate changes and moves on. It may be due to social media or fashion houses and luxury brands pushing their products to desperately generate growth and meet their margins. But one thing is for sure, and I think I can speak for all of us, that it is just exhausting. Yet amidst all this chaos, so to speak, there seems to be this overarching trend which have withstood the test of time, commonly known today as 90s fashion, or 90s minimalist fashion, or if you have lived through the 90s, it was simply known as clothes. One woman in particular is at the center of it all. I've briefly mentioned her in a past video, and I've immediately gotten comments about her style and even requests to do a video focused on her and her fashion alone. And I want to do a video about her. And in many ways, this is a video about her. I have a personal affinity for her style, and I emulate that in my everyday life, whether consciously or subconsciously. But as my subscribers may have noticed, I've established this tendency of failing to talk about simply one thing for every subject matter. Sure, it always starts with one singular thing, but it habitually deviates into something else, because topics are full of dimension and eclectic. I am unable to just talk about Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy's clothes. There are already numerous videos about her fashion with millions of views. Hell, there's even an entire book written solely about her clothes. And sure, I can make a video detailing her looks and analyzing her style, but this is not what this channel is about. I made this channel in the hopes of shedding a different light on fashion, deconstruct what we already know about it, and recontextualizing a subject which is often misunderstood by many. The topic of CBK is like the topic of fashion in this era. For the sake of being concise and capturing immediate attention, fashion trends are often boiled down to just one thing: ballet, Barbie, fairy, cottage, coastal, old money, 80s, 90s. Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy. The very same Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy who is often boiled down to just one thing: 90s fashion. This is not to say there is something inherently wrong with being concise. It makes a trend easier to market for the fashion retailer. It makes it easier to project ourselves onto a particular trend. The way we project our fantasies onto a woman we do not actually know anything about. Most of the details of Carolyn's personal life, especially in relation to her infamous marriage to John F. Kennedy Jr., were not actually known. Despite constantly being hounded by the press, they endeavored to stay out of the public eye as much as possible. 90s was really the beginning of intense tabloid press and the public's unhealthy obsession with celebrities. So much of the speculation surrounding CBK and JFK Jr.'s marriage was based on hearsay, like rumors of divorce prior to their deaths, and Carolyn's alleged infidelity, which further fueled the public's fascination with Carolyn. And this sentiment has truly transcended time and has carried on until now with a sudden surge and revival in her popularity. I think of her almost like the Mona Lisa. It is a mystique and enigma which draws us in. Her fashion cultivates this image, which creates this idea of her seeming demure effortlessness. Contrary to more traditional fashion icons like Audrey Hepburn, Grace Kelly, Jane Birkin, to name a few, Carolyn was not someone of notoriety, having come from relatively humble beginnings. If you really think about it, she was one of the earliest, if not the first ever influencer, in the sense that she was simply an ordinary person. Not to say she was not extraordinary in her own way, but she certainly was not renowned the way a more traditional celebrity was in that era. When we think of the traditional celebrity at that time, like a 60s movie star or 90s supermodel, we associate it with glamour and extravagance. They represented ideals to aspire to, the ultimate fantasy. In contrast, Carolyn was one of the first celebrities to gain popularity based on her down-to-earth image. Before she met JFK Jr., she was a publicist for Calvin Klein, and she was already running in New York's elite circles, having given the opportunity to dress high-profile individuals due to her job. But she was what you would imagine the standard successful woman or person to be in New York. They are not people who are particularly famous or sometimes even affluent. They are people who made it up the corporate ladder and found themselves in the right place meeting the right people. This was who Carolyn was even before she met JFK, and she just so happened to have met him when he became a client of Calvin Klein, and her position allowed her to interact with him. When they started dating, it attracted a great deal of scrutiny and skepticism towards his choice of her, which, when viewed from today's lens, is quite frankly insulting to the woman. But it was a very prevalent phenomenon back then, the belief that a woman did not live up to the expectations of who this man should be with. Carolyn was a seeming nobody, except she was not a nobody. She was, as I said, someone who was more regular on paper. But I would not hesitate to guess that JFK likely saw something in her, as how we saw something in her. And this is exactly what I want to discuss with regards to her fashion. I talk about all this backstory of hers because it is a particular important perspective on her personal style. The concept of personal style is a topic which has been discussed over and over, and at present, I notice a resurgence in its popularity, especially in relation to the oversaturation of fashion trends. The running consensus seems to be the lack of individuality these trends promote, and people are beginning to push the idea of rediscovering individual style, which I agree with, personally. I see this concept going hand in hand with the topic of CBK actually, because she embodies this concept so well, and it is most probably the main reason for her sudden revival. I have to note that we are looking back at her sense of style in a retrospective manner, because in the 90s, while she was still popular and her fashion captured the interest of many, it was obviously seen differently then than it is seen now. For those of you who have lived through the 90s and have rightfully pointed out, Carolyn's way of dressing represented the standard prototype for a working woman in New York or London, or any other cosmopolitan city. Simplistic yet put together, which I briefly mentioned in my video on the Row. And it's also something I believe brands like the Row are emulating. Other similar brands being Kate or Totem, designers which would be very on brand for Carolyn's look if she were still alive today. Yet at our present time, with the prevalence of social media peddling ideas upon ideas, we tend to spin a narrative around this aesthetic, the chic, effortless look, the clean girl look, the model off-duty look. It is the whole reason aesthetics like 90s minimalism and normcore even became a thing. What is ironic is the fact that these aesthetics are not anything new, as many have pointed out in the Row video. It is simply an existing look with a modern twist. Calvin Klein, which Carolyn famously worked for back in the day, was renowned for creating the effortless cool girl look, the skinny model without a care in the world look. To which I would add, the 90s supermodel craze has also made a comeback right around the time of CBK's resurgence. And you can say, well, it's just a trend, which it is, and it may likely dissipate at some point down the line. Fashion trends are known to recycle every 20-odd years or so, and we are right around the 20-year mark from the 90s. Yet there is something about the CBK 90s trend which instills this belief by modern women of its timelessness. Then again, the concept of timelessness is another tricky topic to navigate. Timelessness has a bad rep for being synonymous with recycling old material and tediousness. At face value, timelessness is supposedly something classic. But what makes something classic is different depending on the era. What was classic in the 60s is not what was classic in the 90s, and it certainly is not what is classic today. A Chanel tweed suit was at one point in time seen as classic, and if you remember, something Carolyn's mother-in-law, Jackie Kennedy, wore very frequently, but is seen as very antiquated today. One could even say Carolyn's look was her take on classic with a modern twist. The First Lady look, but contemporary. So what is timeless or classic is simply what we collectively agree to be during a particular era. But I will say that there is a running trend of putting a contemporary spin on a once-upon-a-time, quote-unquote, classic look. Manolo's, for instance, is seeing a resurgence, particularly Mary Jane's, which it popularized in the 90s. Mary Jane's being a staple shoe in the 60s and 20s, having now made its comeback, yet evidently looking more modern than it once was. So going back to my earlier point of CBK being the perfect embodiment of individual style, the frequent argument against this is that all she did was simply dress like everyone else back in the day. So perhaps the craze came about because now in the 2020s, with the constant trend overturn, the CBK look seems to stand out more than ever before. But the answer is never that simple. Any odd celebrity nowadays can incorporate an element of CBK into their model off-duty look. Just look at the supermodels of today. For some reason, it just does not appear the same or elicit the same effect. They all just look trendy and fashion-forward. Nothing which makes me believe that it will stand the test of time and return in years to come and be recreated in the future, the way CBK's looks have been recreated time and time again. The reason CBK did it so well is because of the personal touch, and this is all in the details. Yes, she wore those basics, but there is always something unique which tells me something about her character. The famous white shirt tucked into the Yohji Yamamoto skirt, for instance, is a great example of this. First of all, the bold move of wearing a men's white shirt as a woman at that time, especially at a surrounding as stringent as a society gala, was really something else. It takes someone like CBK with an unwavering sense of reassurance in herself to pull that off and make it look plausible. Because the sort of scrutiny one could subject themselves into is, I'm sure, not lost on any of us. Anything which even hinted at unconformity would be social suicide. But she took that chance on herself and wore that shirt, giving just enough of a masculine touch, yet simultaneous sensuality to make the overall look feminine, with a slightly revealing décolletage and relaxed neckline. It is also interesting to note that Carolyn would often be found folding both ends of a white shirt to create that crisscross neckline, like the Yohji shirt she wore for this famous outfit at the Whitney Museum in March '99. Tucked into the fitted Yohji Yamamoto maxi skirt, paying homage to alternative independent designers, yet still staying true to the unspoken dress code, and the way she rolled up the long cuffs in such crisp simplicity. Nothing overt, but it manages to be sexy and feminine. She really pioneered this look, the woman's tuxedo, as some have coined the term. The pièce de résistance, in my opinion, is the fit. And this really speaks to me as someone living at this day and age. The fit. Something I find even luxury designers would fail to get right. Carolyn's philosophy with clothing, besides the simplicity, is the impeccable, bespoke-like tailoring. Her style tells me that clothes are meant to fit us. Yet time and time again, we find ourselves fitting into clothes. The inconsistent, arbitrary sizing in every brand, collection, and pieces is, to say the least, infuriating. I know the oversized look is very much a thing at present, but even an oversized shirt, coat, or blazer can be made to fit you, which does not appear to be the case with a lot of designer brands nowadays. I talked about the issue I have with fit and sizing in another previous video based on my experience with Jacquemus, an example of a supposedly luxury designer who does not seem to be designing their clothes for the average-looking body type. To which I've noticed a similar running trend with other designers who could care less whether their clothes would fit their clientele, as long as it captures sufficient attention to sell. Then again, the dawn of quality decline in luxury has embarked upon us. But it really is astonishing how such a core essence of clothing itself, and what ties a look together, has become a complete oversight to these well-renowned designers, when the 90s executed the art of fit so brilliantly. So the return of CBK's influence makes tremendous sense, and I would argue a paramount necessity in fashion at the moment. Because right now, it really feels like clothes are wearing us. Carolyn considered clothes as a second skin. I never looked at any of her outfits and thought they did not belong on her or that they took attention away from her. The clothes never outshone her. Look at the coats she wore, for instance. Every aspect from the shoulders to the bodice, right down to the skirt, accentuates her body. If the coat came with the belt, they would often be buttoned up to create the desired effect of completion. Her clothes look as though they were made to fit her. Good tailoring is a simple concept that goes over our heads in terms of its importance these days. I think of every dress she wore, and whether it is an LBD or a nonchalant slip dress, they always fit her like a glove. I think the biggest problem with today's fashion is the tendency of perceiving fashion as an idea rather than viewing it in proximity to the individual. The explosive trends with varying aesthetics is evidence of this. Who do you want to be, as opposed to who are you? There is nothing inherently wrong with trying new things and buying into new trends. But when these ideas come from external sources with self-benefiting intentions, like the behemoth that is fashion marketing, what it inevitably becomes is plain dress-up rather than a journey of self-discovery, which is what fashion is meant to be to the everyday individual. Hence, I have this belief that the 90s comeback is fueled by an anti-movement of what luxury fashion is doing to us. And if you think about it, it ties in seamlessly with some of the other fashion movements like underconsumption and even the Bratz girl movement of rejecting superfluous glamour. So this brings me to the reason why I think Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy has been brought to the forefront of this conversation. Carolyn was someone who knew who she was. Her fashion consistently provides this narrative. In the memoir specifically dedicated to her style, every person who spoke about her remembered her as someone who knew exactly what she wanted. A quote which stood out to me the most was what Manolo Blahnik said in relation to the concept of style, in which he said he was not quite sure what style meant today, but one thing he knew for sure was that Carolyn always knew what she wanted, and that, to him, was style. And this, I think, truly encapsulates the concept of personal style. I discussed the notion of timeless fashion and what makes fashion timeless. But the truth of the matter is, there is nothing more timeless than knowing who you are and knowing what you want as an individual. Internet culture has desecrated our relationship with ourselves. We have been made to believe that nothing is real until it is externally projected. Ostensibly, this means that we view ourselves in relation and comparison to what is externally projected by others on the internet. The need to seek approval and to stand out, but also conform to expectations. Naturally, this unhealthy obsession fell victim to fashion advertising, who took advantage of our insecurities in order to sell us an idea of ourselves we should pursue, when we were all fine to begin with. Even the 90s trend had been immediately caught on and utilized by the industry to sell you the idea of the it girl, like Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy. She is effortlessly chic and captivating without trying, when what made her chic and captivating was not her clothes. It was her. It was her character who made the clothes chic and captivating. She alone made those decisions for her fashion choices, because that was who she was. She paid meticulous attention to those subtle details because she cared for that attention to detail. She chose the Narciso Rodriguez slip dress for her wedding because she had an affinity to small under-the-radar independent designers. The act of shopping from small indie designers needs to make a comeback, or at the very least, be brought into the limelight. I found a personal interest in indie designers because of CBK, having seen her put pieces together from an indie brand, but pairing it with a bag from Prada or Hermes. In fact, some of her best looks came from lesser-renowned designers. It did not matter to her as long as the garment did their job and achieved her intended outcome. She had spoken about the functionality of her coats as a working woman in New York, that coats were meant to serve a purpose, to keep you warm all day long when running around the city, as opposed to coats which were simply ornamental, for girls to get in a car to their destination and return home in that same car without having to actually step outside in the New York winter cold. And you resonate with that belief because you have seen pictures of her running around New York City with JFK in those types of coats you yourself would wear when running around the city. There is this huge emphasis on form following function in 90s fashion, which is what Carolyn often referred to in her clothes, the straightforwardness of it all. But what captivated me the most about 90s fashion is how much the style follows the character. Carolyn's style would not have made the same impact it did without her character. And this is the point I intend to make with the return of CBK. The inspiration behind her style has to be internalized before it can be externalized. Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy knew who she was, and more importantly, she knew her worth. She worked her way up the career ladder and made something of herself prior to meeting JFK Jr. She was Carolyn Bessette prior to being Mrs. Kennedy. She was seen as Carolyn Bessette rather than as JFK's wife. Sure, we all knew of their marriage, and it brought her into the limelight momentarily, but it was her enigmatic character which kept her under the spotlight. She was her own person, in spite of being JFK's wife. It was her individuality who made the clothes she put on her back compelling. Whenever I recall a memorable look from a style or fashion icon, I remember how it was worn by the person more than the outfit itself, because it is them who makes it memorable and compelling. Audrey Hepburn's black impeccably fitted Givenchy dress in Breakfast at Tiffany's showed me a strong-willed, talented actress who played a rather controversial role of that era, which was not even meant for her when it was written, and yet she killed it anyways by making the character her own. Hepburn was known to have worked closely with Hubert de Givenchy on a lot of her own costuming. Princess Diana's revenge dress showed me a woman defying adversity, pain, and trauma at the hands of an infamously tumultuous marriage, to appear before the world when she could have hidden away to reel from heartbreak. The off-the-shoulder and risque silhouette symbolized her freeing herself from the confines of royal protocol and public scrutiny. I look back at every one of CBK's looks. I remember them as how the clothes were worn by her, the self-assurance and how she carried herself. The slip dress under an unbuttoned coat with her headband and oval shades, alongside JFK in his suit and snapback pushing his bike in the middle of New York City. They looked like any odd young couple in the big city, drawing attention without drawing attention onto themselves. I remember the different ways she wore that same headband, those sunglasses, that coat, that Prada bag, and a number of other looks. It tells me that this was a woman who wore her coats and used her bags repeatedly, despite having the means to purchase an excessive amount of Hermes and Prada bags. She used the same black Hermes bag to work and to run her errands, a bag worn almost to death. Much like how the Olsen twins wore their Hermes bags to death, an image which sticks with me more than any Kardashian-Jenner with their hundreds of Hermes bags. Making full utility of the intended purpose of the item has made its comeback with the Bratz girl ideology of wearing your clothes to death, and was the incentive behind the design of the Birkin, as intended by Jane Birkin herself, designed for its functionality for the everyday woman. Jane Birkin, who famously uses basket bags from some flea market as opposed to an expensive designer bag, much like how CBK wore a $30 Ella Bean tote while strolling along the boardwalk at Martha's Vineyard. I am reminded of these things when I see these looks. I am reminded of Carolyn, the person she was. Her collection was small yet powerful. She was powerful. She is powerful. Carolyn taught me I too can create omnipotence and omnipresence in my own small wardrobe, but it has to come from within, who I am before what I wear. CBK in the 90s have redefined modern femininity in a number of ways. Whenever I think of the two, I return to the early seasons of Sex and the City, where not only the concept of a modern woman's independence is introduced and redefining our view of relationships with men, but also the fashion of the main characters, especially in season 1, which in my opinion stands out the most in its representation of the 90s. Like CBK, some of the characters' clothes were worn in various ways, in various looks. Like her, the characters themselves make the clothes memorable. And like her style, the show has seen a recent resurgence and viewed retrospectively. Carrie Bradshaw's character and her relationship to Mr. Big being recontextualized. Carrie, who was then seen as witty, quirky, and flawed, now comes across as immature, inconsiderate, and problematic. Her friendships with Miranda, Samantha, and Charlotte seen as unfairly balanced towards her egocentric self, and her romance with Mr. Big seen as toxic and driven purely by limerence. Even her self-comparison to Barbra Streisand's character Katie Murawski in The Way We Were leans heavily on pygmy undertones. As I've pointed out how the character must come before the fashion, our retrospective perception on the character of CBK fits into this narrative. It does not take twice to see how CBK and the character of Natasha Nijinsky are quite synonymous with each other. Both Carolyn and Natasha worked for renowned fashion houses like Calvin Klein and Ralph Lauren. Bridget Moynihan had even reportedly taken inspiration from Carolyn. When the storyline in season 3 first aired, Natasha was seen as a villain, or the stick insect with no soul, as Carrie had put it. Plain and simple and lacking depth. Yet looking back, Natasha's simplicity in both philosophy and her wardrobe choices came from a place of self-awareness, confidence, and being true to oneself. Unlike Carrie's endless prying for Mr. Big's attention, Natasha left immediately upon discovering her husband's infidelity, and eviscerated Carrie's pathetic attempt of an apology. Natasha knew her worth and stood up for her boundaries. In this era, her actions are viewed as powerful and respectable, something you could not say in the same regard for characters like Carrie and Katie, who create a narrative of men perpetually picking the quote-unquote plain simple girl, as opposed to the eccentric, complicated girl, as they view themselves to be. A narrative once foisted upon Carolyn, who many believe to have been chosen by JFK purely for her plain, simple, easily digestible character, when JFK most probably saw the depth in her character, as how we see in her retrospectively. Her image greatly contrasts that of her mother-in-law, Jackie Kennedy Onassis, was a representation of a bygone era and an antiquated idea of a woman and her place in the world by her husband's side, rather than her own person, who overlooked her husband's repeated and abashed infidelities, and stuck around despite being grossly disrespected and mistreated. Though not to say it was a fault of her own, and Jackie's narrative had also been rewritten in recent years to indicate a strong-willed woman of independent thought and desires, I hesitate to believe Carolyn would stand to be mistreated by Jackie and JFK's son in such a way. Being a Carolyn and Natasha takes unwavering confidence. It takes being true to your core no matter the circumstances. It takes self-awareness, a trait characters like Carrie and Katie lack. And whenever I think of the fashion of other strong characters I know, like Samantha Jones and Blair Waldorf, whose style, while drastically different to the likes of Carolyn and Natasha, exudes self-assurance and a force to be reckoned with, because it works with who they are. Samantha being bold, confident, unapologetic for who she is. Blair for her ambition, tenacity, and perseverance. Fashion and character are intrinsically linked. Shows like Sex and the City and Gossip Girl tell us this. It is why the fashion and Emily in Paris fail, because the characters fail as characters. Probably with the exception of Sylvie Gretteau, whose style most overlook as the Parisian je ne sais quoi, when it works because she has the strongest character in the show, contrasting her French counterpart, Camille, whom despite the consistent Parisian looks, pales in comparison to Sylvie due to her lack of character and shaky morals in the later seasons. It is interesting to note that Sylvie is dressed in a fair amount of Rick Owens and Yohji Yamamoto, much like Carolyn herself. Confidence in your personal style requires confidence in yourself, being true to who you are in spite of the circumstances. And this requires knowing who you are. The conversation surrounding the revisitation of once popular shows indicates unprecedented self-awareness in this generation. Discussions of the effects of social phenomena have gained tremendous prominence. Even media itself have become more self-aware than ever. Shows like Succession and The Boys deconstruct character tropes of the hero and villain and inject nuance into their characters. One of the most distinguished representation of such unwavering character I recall actually comes from The Boys. Homelander's egocentric and psychopathic tendencies are fueled by his need for attention and externalized approval. He feeds off of the public's perception of him, and it is ultimately what gives him his influence and power. Yet contrast is someone like Stan Edgar, whom Homelander repeatedly attempts to condescend, and even when Homelander successfully takes his company Vought away from him out of petty vengeance. To Homelander's horror, Stan Edgar's confidence does not even falter, because unlike Homelander, his confidence is something which comes from within. His power comes from his belief in himself, as opposed to Homelander's outward need for approval.
You're not even pathetic. You're just nothing.
Then why are you still here? Looking for my approval like I'm your daddy?
Personal style has to come from within. Personal style requires self-awareness. Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy's personal style taught me this. This is how I choose to remember her. And perhaps in a world lost in fleeting external praise and approval, it is just what we need to save us from ourselves.